Good day.
Hi guys, this one is about the Cult of Stalin. We were trying to figure out here exactly how Stalin built this personality cult, where people, despite the fact he killed 35 million of his own, worshipped him.
So, the first thing is, this whole period is essentially Stalin trying to consolidate. That means secure, build up, make sure he has more power over Russia to ensure that he has total control over the country. Now, we've already mentioned before the purges, where he gets rid of any potential enemies. But you can't rule through fear alone. Eventually, people are going to rebel. It may not be in 5 years or 10 years, but eventually the sons of the people you killed, the daughters of the people you killed, are coming back to you. So, he also needs to simultaneously, and if you notice the dates, it's the same dates as the purges, command respect and love from the masses. Okay, if people don't love him and think he's a caring genius, they might think the purges are actually because he's evil. And actually, what he wants to give the impression of is like, there are bad people about. I promise, we're just doing them, and I wish I could be nice, but I can't possibly. People can go, yeah, that's fine though. I mean, you know, my aunt might have been shot, but you know, it's because of Yezhov. It's Yezhov's fault. If you remember that, everyone was blamed. Yezhov was blamed at the end for all the problems. So, what Stalin is doing...
And shot in 1940.
And shot in 1938, sir.
No, it was 1940.
1938.
I bet you it's 1940.
Okay, let's Google this. Right, let's have a look. Hope I'm right. This is staying in, by the way. Yezhov. Come on, come on, come on, come on, come on.
1940...
Damn.
Score one for Mr. Raine.
Right.
All right. All right, all right, all right.
Yeah, he was stuck in the gulag in 38. I'm getting confused. Idiot. Anyway, so essentially what's happening is, if people don't love him, they will revolt. So, first things first, before he needs to make his own cult, he needs to make Lenin's cult.
Yeah, so what kind of grew up, it didn't really start as part of Stalin, but it started and was furthered by Stalin, the idea of the cult of Lenin. Lenin wanted to be burnt, cremated, that is, and have his ashes scattered to the wind as soon as he died, but Lenin actually became a Bolshevik hero, in large part due to the work of Stalin as general secretary, forming his death plans and the plans around his funeral. And a cult really develops about Lenin, about how infallible, how intelligent, and how caring he was. He had a huge funeral. He was embalmed. In fact, if you go and visit Moscow today, you can still go visit Lenin's tomb, embalmed and perfectly preserved for all to see in the Kremlin. That's a picture of actually dead Lenin right there, taken in 2007. So anyways, all sorts of propaganda linked to Lenin. And the Bolshevik Party, in many ways, legitimized itself by focusing on the devoted, infallible, intelligent person who founded the Bolsheviks and brought them to power.
So
we know Lenin, of course, to be a little bit more ruthless than that.
Yeah. So the cult of Lenin is well established. Most Russians believe that Lenin was a genius or was kind and was keen. So in the early years, from about 1925, 1926 particularly onwards, Stalin starts trying to make himself look like something we call the natural successor. A successor is someone who follows someone in a job. So a successor to a king, for example, is someone who follows the king, like the son usually. The natural successor is this idea that, in the eyes of, that almost Stalin was a guy who was of course going to follow Lenin. Now this wasn't true. Remember that Lenin thought Stalin was stupid and also increasingly distrusted him. But what's true and what's false doesn't matter. It depends on the propaganda you give. So he wants to send this image that he is the natural successor, the best friend, the person inspired by Lenin. This would mean, and this would massively help Stalin in the leadership contest. You remember in 1926, Stalin is trying to gain support so that he can become leader. He's definitely not leader yet. So by associating himself with Lenin, people increasingly go, you know what, let's go with that Stalin guy. He seems reasonable. And look at all those pictures. Lenin must have loved him. Okay, and this is really helpful in the early years in the power struggle to give Stalin a name and make Stalin liked amongst the public. Now, if you have a look, here are some examples, and actually this is progressive in different years. So the first top photo is from 1925. The second photo, the second painting, is 1929, and the last one is in the mid-1930s. At each stage, Stalin is at first someone beside him, and the propaganda changes. Then actually, it seems like Stalin is learning from Lenin. And then, as you can see, 1930, Stalin is actually a strong man on his own, inspired by Lenin's memory in the background. So what's essentially Stalin does in the early years is fake lots of photos, commission lots of propaganda, which sent this image that Stalin was a natural man to follow Lenin. So if you like Lenin, obviously you've got to go with Stalin because he's one he picked. And this changes and becomes more developed as time goes on.
So Stalin wants to create what's known as a cult of personality. That is, a belief that Stalin himself is intelligent, infallible, and caring, just like Lenin had been. Stalin had become more secure in his position, largely through the fact that he had purged so many people in the 1930s, and he decided it was time to make his own cult, and he had some very real political motives for doing so. Stalin had started some major changes to the way Russians went about their daily lives, the way Russians went about their economy. And he started a process which we will know as industrialization, to be covered in later lessons, collectivization, which had to do with agriculture, and of course the purges are going on throughout this time. And he realized and knew that without the love of the people, people would start to blame him for all of the problems caused by the harsh industrialization and the transitions from the farm to the cities and the collectivization and seizure of the lands and the purges, of course, which murdered countless millions of people. So he needed to build up this cult of personality to, in effect, balance out the negative with some of the positive. And the idea was to effectively bombard people with images of himself, images of him, Russian culture, ideas, education, and they will show all of them when put together and imply that Stalin, for all of the reasons stated, is the perfect leader.
Absolutely, and it's the key to this idea. If you see a poster with Stalin, it's great, you might go, well, okay, it's a poster. But if everywhere you look, every different media, education, culture, art, music, poetry, images, everywhere you look, it's celebrating this idea that Stalin is a great leader. Eventually you might start going, you know what, Stalin is probably a great leader. So, what image did Stalin want to project in this propaganda? I.e., what did Stalin want to look like? You know, there are three big arguments. Firstly, he wants to look like a benefactor. A benefactor is someone who very often grows up from a relatively poor background, through hard work, makes his own way, and now looks out in the interest of his people. Okay? A kind man, a man who cares about his people and is very generous. He also wants to make himself look like a traditional defender of the people. The idea that he's the guy who is always on the people's side. Now, throughout the rest of his regime, he really capitalizes and tries to build up this idea that whenever something goes wrong, if only Stalin knew, then it would be fixed. That means that his government, industrialization, collectivization, the purges, for example, people would see it happening, their aunt would be dragged off by the NKVD, but because they believe that, you know, Stalin, he's the defender of the people, he defends the little guy, he's the good guy, he couldn't possibly have anything to do with this. So therefore, it's actually Yezhov's fault, for example, who was killed in 1940.
Yeah, February, if you want me to be more exact. I don't have the day, I'm not that good.
I hate you. So this idea of traditional people would help people blame other people for the bad things in the government rather than him. And finally, they also want to make sure that he also wants people to believe that he is always a perfect leader. He has almost superhuman intelligence, work ethic, understanding and abilities. So no one could replace him. Why would you get rid of this man who can run a state this big? There's a lot made of this, the fact that it's almost impossible to run such a hard country. And if you notice, all the czars have made a mess of it. But Stalin, because he is a superhuman leader, because he has a fantastic understanding, he is able to run it. So what do these three things do? They make people think more positively for him, they make people blame other people for the mistakes, and they make people realize that there's no one else who could possibly follow. Each of these helps secure Stalin's regime.
So what did it look like and how was it developed? One of the first things, of course, was children from a very young age needed to be brought up believing in the cult. And Stalin, of course, naturally focuses on public school buildings, such as schools and nurseries, which become adorned with his photograph and his sayings, and books celebrating his greatness, and so on and so forth. The news.
In 1929, he has his 50th birthday. He gets 350 kilograms, which was celebrated by everyone. And then a historian had a look at these organisations with some telegrams saying, "Congratulations, happy birthday, we love you." It turns out a lot of these didn't even exist, so there's only one place they could have come from. But what this is doing is this image that everyone loves him. Why don't you?
Stalin, for a short period of time, becomes the world's leading commissioner of marble statues of himself, and he actually, in most Russian cities and towns, get large images or large statues of Stalin. You can take a look at the bottom center of the screen in front of you to see an example of a giant one that was built in Russia. These are pretty much everywhere. Poems and songs, such as the Ode to Stalin by Prokofiev, celebrate his greatness and his benevolence, and so on and so forth. A whole art school really develops around Stalin. It's known as socialist realism, and socialist realism aims to portray the beneficial reality of socialism, and it shows that at the top, of course, is Stalin helping everybody out. The middle picture on the right, and actually to an extent the top picture on the right too, are examples of perfect socialist realism. Buildings are adorned with his photo, as seen in the top left. Flags everywhere, with his photo next to Lenin's and the party leadership in the larger, broader Russian flag. There are parades on his birthday that celebrate him. These parades are highly orchestrated. They include athletes, they include soldiers, everybody showing how great Stalin was. And of course, the idea being that as you saw these people walk by, you would marvel at the society that Stalin has created, the power of this Russia that he has created, and he renamed streets and towns after him. Stalingrad, as Volgograd is changed to Stalingrad, for instance.
Absolutely right. So, and what we get, to some extent, is a saturation. Saturation means when something is soaked through, you have a saturation of images. Everywhere you look, you see Stalin's great, Stalin's amazing, Stalin's intelligent. And over time, particularly to a relatively ill-educated and in some regards illiterate and relatively politically unsophisticated population, this kind of works. And what this does is really builds up a sense that Stalin is a good guy. He is that benefactor. He is that defender of people, and he is that perfect leader. And as I said, that in turn leads to people going, "Thank you, Stalin, you are so generous. Stalin couldn't possibly be behind this collectivization that's making me sad, this industrialization that's making me sad, these purges that make me sad. And also, how could we possibly replace Stalin? Who else is genius enough?" There's another element as well of the cult. It's one thing sending a message about how brilliant you are. But unfortunately, there's some parts of history which don't really fit the myth. Okay? For example, Stalin increasingly sends a message that he's Lenin's best friend, best ally, and he was with him in the 1917 stuff, for example. Problem is, there's not many photos of that because he wasn't there. And guess who was there? Trotsky. So, how do you clear us all up? Well, if you look at the bottom of that photo, which I'm sure you'll see less in the bottom right, this, if you can look quite closely, just Lenin's stairs giving a speech in 1917, and if you look to the right, it's just stood on the stairs up to that, there is Trotsky, and there he's gone. Removing the idea that Trotsky is the ally of Lenin helps secure this idea that Stalin was a natural successor, when actually it was Trotsky, if you remember from the last lesson. As well as this, if you look at the top left-hand corner, there's Yezhov, but very quickly it becomes very politically unacceptable to have Yezhov, so the photo is edited. Okay. As well as this, events in the October Revolution and stuff around 1917, as well as what happened afterwards, are rewritten to put Stalin at the centre with Lenin. Stalin had very little to do, had nothing to do in February 1917, and very little to do with October 1917, where he wasn't really even in the city. He was organising stuff on the periphery. So, but that was rewritten, so he was basically the man who did the stuff which Lenin dictated. Obviously that was Trotsky, but who cares? Rewrite the history. This is, and obviously how do you back up with specific facts, date and date? Well, in 1938, all of this rewritten history was codified, what means put into a list in the official Communist Party textbook, for schools and also members, the history of the All-Union Communist Party, which basically massively rewrote the history of Russia, mostly and by in any way that he wanted, in Stalin's favour. I.e., Stalin was the man under Lenin. There's no such thing as Trotsky. He was a genius. Blah 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 blah. This sold 34 million copies by 1948. Where, if you think if this is being used in schools, that's being looked at by far many more people. So, what's happening here? Stalin not only is creating an image in the future and how brilliant he is, he's rewriting the past to get rid of the bits which don't fit into that myth about him. They don't want to remind people that there were other contenders. They don't remind people that maybe he wasn't natural successor. They don't want to remind people that he was in part responsible for the purges.
So what are the overall effects of the cult of personality? It's like there's an 8-mark question waiting to be asked right here. And a couple important things to consider. Number one, this does help develop a genuine belief that Stalin was a great person amongst a lot of the Soviets. In fact, a few years ago in Russia, they had a poll of who are Russia's greatest leaders, and Stalin was number one.
Yep.
The cult of personality still has lasting impact. Now, of course, there's a benefit for him, too, because it means that it's easier for him to blame other people for the problems, the hardships of industrialization, for the purges. Stalin famously, of course, will blame Yezhov for the purges, and people didn't believe that Stalin was capable of such horrific things, and they were more akin to believe the lie that Yezhov had came up with this idea of the purges, that he was an American, British, and German pawn, and that he was merely undermining the Soviet regimes. What are some of the things Stalin blamed him with? Of course, it also gives Stalin a sense of legitimacy, considering that Russia should have been run by committee, and Stalin had taken power centrally for himself by 1928. It does give the idea that Stalin should be the legitimate ruler of Russia. It also reduces opposition to Stalin.
So, to some extent, if you don't remember that there's Trotsky, for example, it's very difficult to say, well, I don't like Stalin. Basically, if people remember Trotsky, people are like, I like that guy Trotsky, he knew what he was doing, and he wasn't Stalin. I want Trotsky back. Remember, Trotsky's not got the ice pick for the head quite yet. Instead, if you erase any potential people who are an alternative to Stalin, if you say there's no such thing as Trotsky, don't you remember Trotsky was a betrayer, and who's Kamenev? I don't know what you're talking about, Zinoviev. No, those guys, they were just like peripheral people. Remember that they also traited.
It says so in my textbook.
Exactly, it says so in my textbook. Who else is there to support? And if there's no one else to support, then naturally, what do you do? You just naturally at least accept Stalin, if not love him. And that's very, very important to make sure that there's no real organization against him. Stalin is too savvy to let anyone who's a threat stand against him. But this helps that stop being a threat, very much so.
Okay, so those are the effects of the cult of personality, and what we have here is a very important cult of Stalin, one of the ways that Stalin really helps solidify his dictatorship. That's all we have for you today. I'm Mr. Raine.
And Mr. Suter.
See you soon.